Hello, welcome to the Rough Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 22 entitled Tradition and Culture. It follows up on episode 21, Force, Power, Rule, and Persuasion. This is a series of kind of ruminations that I'm using to kind of collect my ideas and put them together so that they can kind of be purposeful in relationship to my work. Anyway, I started, I believe, December of last year and kind of gone through to where we are now. Started with this idea, which what I call the operation of the metaphor, and then I decided to kind of put that into kind of perspective in terms of what that was, as is a kind of very important aspect in what I would say my work is. So I talked about the idea of the organic metaphor, which I believe is kind of a natural thing that basically kind of gives rise to what we call metaphor. I mean, we most likely understand the idea of the metaphor as a result of kind of something that we invented as an aesthetic thing, and then it comes from language. But uh, I'm not a language philosopher. I don't kind of follow that tradition. I believe that there are things that are beyond that in nature that things come from, and they're not just kind of like games. So anyway, in that regard, I feel as if it was important to kind of establish the fact that I believe that this kind of trends, this kind of like presupposes the artificial or aesthetic metaphor that I talked about in terms of the idea of going from kind of like a simpler state to a more complex state by the idea of kind of like the embodiment of things within other things, that once things kind of like coalesced, that concepts could basically kind of like coalesce and then create greater concepts, so that these things that we see over time is this kind of I guess accretion. I wouldn't say concrescence, but I don't want to kind of give myself away. But in terms of, I don't even think concrescence is a proper term in this case, but the accretion of aspects as a result of kind of like the entanglement of things and concepts is what we see in nature that allows us to go from simpler to more complex. And as a result of the fact, we find greater intricacy and complexity. So I found that this metaphor was something that like doesn't wasn't invented; it was discovered, and it's kind of something that had two aspects. It had an aesthetic aspect, and it had a kind of social aspect. What I call the aesthetic was in something we would understand in literature and art, music, things like that. And then there was the unbreakable bond, or what a proto metaphor, which is something I see in society, which is slightly different because these things, though they are metaphors in the fact that they kind of bond, they basically have a life that's kind of decided by societal kind of things. And what I mean by unbreakable bonds is the fact that these things exist purposefully at a certain point, and then basically, can be uncoupled and replaced by something better. So an example I used of that, something I'll talk about tonight, is the idea, the fact that like we have technique or traditions, and we basically in the past uh, wedded the understanding of those things to religion or superstition or kind of other kind of mythological things. But in fact, what we realize is that when we came to understand the fact that there's a greater enhancement to deepening our understanding of these things by kind of relating that to reason and science. So I gave an example of that, and we'll talk about that in the piece, because what happened was, as I went through there, and then I went through these things, I went to like some ideas about my work. From there, we kind of went into, the value and necessity of criticism, the art of finding what needs to be said. Talked about criticism as kind of like an idea of kind of like of an indictment or an indicator of societal health. Talked about drawing. Then we started to kind of talk about more kind of idea related things, and eventually kind of started to get to the point where we're kind of really establishing those things that kind of like understand the way in which one goes about generating work. um, so where we were now is the last pieces we've been talking about. What is an unbreakable bond? What are important unbreakable bonds? The importance of unbreakable bonds, and that's what we kind of came to: force, power, rule, and persuasion, where I basically kind of did a kind of like basic uh, general overview of things related to two books that kind of come around the same time. One is Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas, and the other one is Ortega Gasset's Revolt of the Masses. And I kind of contrasted these things in terms of some of the similarities, as well as some of the things that were kind of like different in terms of the two pieces. I felt that Ortega's was good as a kind of critique of a societal circumstance, but in terms of his pathology, when he kind of charts out the etiology of what he believes caused this or what he sees, I feel as if that part was really kind of quite weak. Whereas I think in the case of Adventures of Ideas, though some of their similar things talked about in terms of basic fundamental principles, I feel Whitehead basically kind of describes as his nature, the kind of overcoming the obstacle of metaphysics in cosmology and ontology that had kind of plagued us pretty much since Kant. And I think that one thing I've kind of started to think about is that what happened was Whitehead didn't see Kant as the mistake, but kind of like the maybe like the skid marks after the mistake had taken place. So he kind of like goes back maybe a step past that to people like Hume and Locke, and then basically kind of comes back through that. So he kind of avoids those kind of things. But anyway, Process and Reality is an incredibly overwhelming book. I think that it's, understanding special relativity is the kind of thing that maybe a handful of people ever really understand it. I think the same goes for Whitehead's Process and Reality. I feel that I kind of have an understanding of some of the simpler pieces, aims of education, and Adventures of Ideas are certainly two books that I felt comfortable with, and I feel as if these things are very helpful. Anyway, so what happened was, one of the other reasons why this project came about was I was engaged with the possibility of doing a book project. And as a result, I had been writing a series of kind of essays. One of the essays I wrote was called Tradition and Culture, which I thought was necessary to point out some of the things in terms of kind of like what makes something meaningful in terms of a societal circumstance as relates to traditions. And are there kind of like potentials for kind of like unbreakable bonds that have a consequence. So what I did was I found the piece that I'd written for that book, and I thought what I'll do is I'm going to read the piece, so then I kind of like, and then I'm going to kind of like critique it, because I feel as if like since this was written, which was probably 2 years ago, a year and a half, 2 years ago, there's probably been some updates in terms of my thinking. So let's kind of get into that. And what I'll have to do is after that, it's like, hi, Puddle.
Hi, Puddle.
Hi. Do we have anything to talk about work-wise with you?
What?
Do we have anything to talk about work-wise this week? Actually, we should do a segment. It's like Julie this week. I like that. It's like Julie this week.
You can hold up my painting.
No, until it's ready. Let's talk about drawing.
Actually, this fits in with this piece, which you've never shown, fits in. My other hand has chocolate on it.
Yes.
This fits
Why do you want to put chocolate on it?
No, I can't hold it with my
Okay.
hand.
This is Julie's very beautiful but very ephemeral kind of drawing. It's kind of a piece that's attached to a piece that was done before. This is the second time Julie's used this particular substrate, which is from the Metropolitan Museum. And it says, what's that say?
It says Calantrophy, RNA interference.
Mm-hmm. Extinguishes the potato beetle.
Yeah.
Okay. What's that?
The Colorado.
The Colorado potato beetle. Okay.
Yeah.
So explain to us what we see here in terms of this beautiful.
Well.
Okay. It's better you see the drawing.
Okay. What we see here is I had read about, believe it or not, a new kind of pesticide, a biological control agent that solves a lot of problems, because the problems with blanket pesticides is they kill everything. They kill the butterflies, they impact the bees, and have actually had a huge hand along with the varroa mite in the honeybee colony collapse disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So they poison birds, they poison plants. This particular type just targets a protein in the particular target, the Colorado potato beetle. And the pesticide is marketed under the name Calantha, and I believe it's by a company called Greenlight Biosciences. They're impossible to reach. I thought they would actually be very interested in
Right.
seeing this because no one ever does a
So
drawing.
this is
inspired by
basically
pesticides.
I remember this
Mhm.
ceramic piece that you took, and then
Christopher Dresser.
Christopher Dresser,
Mhm.
yeah, and then you basically had it almost to look as if it's kind of like
Trophy.
a trophy, but also like a paper wasp nest, and the fact that
Mhm.
it's kind of appended itself to the substrate, which is in this case the tea room
Yeah.
that they built at the Met, and then you kind of see this kind of metastasizing uh, mass that comes from it. Now, in the terms of the mass that I see here, is there a system or a process that's inherent in that kind of like descriptive process that you talked about?
Well, yes, because one of the things that you and I discussed tonight about another piece
Mm-hmm.
is how the organic becomes the inorganic and how to make an effective hybrid of the two. I mean, as we've said, bad science fiction, bad fiction, it proposes a hybrid that makes no sense, that doesn't even, I mean,
Mm,
it sort of looks like a color form
mm,
stuck over something else.
mm,
Or, like if you take a lion's body and you stick a pair of wings on it, then you stick scales, then you stick a dragon's head. I mean, something that's not well reasoned and well thought out,
mm,
that has no reason to exist
mm,
or function, and in fact doesn't even look like it's capable
mm-hmm.
of functioning, would be exactly that.
Great.
In this case, the Christopher Dresser vase has a very stylized, beautiful porcelain
Mm-hmm.
beetle. Now, what I've done is it morphs from the base to the thorax, and by the time you get to the head, it's a real Colorado potato
Got it.
beetle, as are the four
So
legs and
this
the
emerges.
antenna.
This emerges as a series of kind of elements out of the kind of like metastasizing aspects of the
Yeah,
Christopher
almost
Dresser
like a
piece.
cicada would
Interesting.
emerge from its own
Interesting.
exoskeleton.
Uh-huh. Got
And
it.
it hangs like a Dutch Vanitas trophy
Mm. Okay,
from
yeah, that's true.
from the
Yeah, it's
rafters,
basically hung like or
which
like you
is
would dry
why,
meat or like some kind of
yes,
like trophy.
or
Got
the
it.
birds that were hung in the bars, they would hang all their fowl that way,
Right.
which is why it's called Calantha trophy.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. All right.
Thank you.
We're gonna do that. It's like this week in
Sure.
Julie.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
All
Kyle.
right. So let's read.
I made a cameo.
Oh, I think we should have a cameo every week. I think just
Okay.
before I should do
Sure.
like a basic introduction,
Okay.
and then like we do like a 5-minute like this week in Julie.
I'm very honored to be your cameo.
Okay. All right.
I'm very proud.
You're the best one.
I love you,
I
Paul.
love you. Okay.
Okay.
I'll forget.
Yeah, I don't want to take.
All right.
pictures.
So,
Thank you.
all right. So let's see. The piece is called Tradition and Culture. Okay. So tradition and culture as it relates to purpose. Each society that is established understands its essential desire for its survival. Whereas at a certain point, when purpose is established, we see culture. However, it is not necessarily when this happens, or it is not inevitable. But more important, but what is essential that purpose manifests, otherwise tradition does not establish culture. So what are we talking about? So the point is, that's the basic premise, is that we understand these two things of traditions and culture. And I think we also could kind of look at things and kind of say like, okay, they're kind of like synonyms, but like in this case, Bruce, what are you using to establish the difference and how is that difference manifest? Okay. Survival isn't now what I've done is I've hinted at the idea that survival is something that kind of brings us to be able to start to kind of like manifest ways in which we can protect that, in which we can protect ourselves, our society, and whatever. So survival is an instinct that appears as inherent to us. It drives us, and we can choose to ignore it or disengage from it, but it seems as if we are engaged in it prior and unassociated from understanding or acknowledging it. As part of this, we establish within this mentality traditions, which manifest in thoughts and actions in order to aid in our survival. These can exist indefinitely as long as they remain useful and are not until they are replaced with more efficient methods. All societies begin with this impulse, but some, but not all, will recognize that possibility if this is the case, that their survival is enhanced by linking its traditions to something that will engage tradition, to something that gives it desire to improve, firmer footing. In this case, let us look at a useful analogy. So what I'm saying is, in fact, there's a point where the survival aspect is kind of linked to traditions, and the traditions may be manifest because these activities are simply linked in this kind of very fundamental, kind of like almost feral aspect of a kind of like way in which we kind of try to enhance, kind of in a sense of desperation. Not that the desperation ever goes away, but the desperation is something that we kind of like start as a kind of primary step. Technique is a tradition that we see manifest in all societies to produce products and generate actions and behaviors that defend against those things that threaten the survival of the society. Technique becomes linked to other ideas that guide the direction of its actions and hopefully will generate progress. Many societies link their technique to superstition, religion, fantasy, or mythology, so the nature of that progress was not grounded soundly enough. I may believe that if I use a stick to strike down my enemy, that stick grows stronger because I have taken the soul of my enemy or whatever into my weapon. And as I vanquish more foes, I understand that my physical abilities or my reflexes are vanquishing my foes, that the strength inherent in the weapon basically manifests in me, rather than my misconception that I am now the embodiment of all the fallen foes. So I build an altar to the stick and have ritual dance to worship this instrument and its imagined power. I place it in the sun because I believe the sunlight reinforces and magnifies its power. So now over time, my misplaced understanding prepares me for an unforeseen danger by leaving my weapon exposed to the elements. For instance, it may weaken its physical characteristics, and by coming to believe the invincibility of weapon, I place the emphasis on success in the wrong place. So if my stick then breaks or is shattered by another, I come to believe I succumbed to the soul of the other weapon, not am defeated and killed because I did not train myself properly. So in this case, we see the fact that we are linking our thoughts and our imaginations, our speculations, to something that can't be tested, can't be proved, just has to be imagined. I mean, we all understand the fact that, like, we used to do funny dances, we used to sacrifice virgins, we used to kind of like basically slaughter each other and have these kind of like even cannibalistic, ritualistic kind of like activities that were like just absolutely barbaric in their kind of like brutality, and they were not based on anything. It was just a kind of like a desperate, ignorant kind of desire for something we had no control of. So we had people spending all this time and wasting all these resources on something that turned out to be quite savage and brutal and meaningless and useless. So now what happens is we've kind of found that unbreakable bond that was maybe useful in the fact that maybe people had positive feelings about it and maybe felt that it did work. But the reality was, once we uncoupled that and we coupled the traditions with science, we found that we had a more kind of like beneficial relationship in the fact that we could actually benefit from greater understanding of our technique. So now let's take this analogy and apply it to tradition in general. How is our survival purposed? It is purposed because it can manifest effectively. Your curiosity can see its imagination grow and become more effective. Not only do we see this manifest, but you can also reflect on traditions and discover the truth that was about what was valuable and why. So, however, and to tend to maintenance of my weapon. However, what we see in a different instance is technique linked to science. And maybe here we see a more effective and potentially unbreakable bond. As I test my weapon and use experiments and my knowledge, I gain of materials and physiology. With critical thinking, analysis, and acumen, I can actively chart progress. I can map it, chart it, predict it. I can use my imagination now not to guess at fantasy, but to understand reality. As a result, I can test these articles of my imagination, born of my curiosity, of my what if. The tradition can now be mined, and with the understanding of the same critical acumen, you can look at your creations and look to discover their purpose. Though I believe that is well, science let me use the term reason as to mean that which is born from that which can be effectively appraised and valued. and can predict advancement to greater effectiveness. The imagination employed within tradition can not effectively used to predict any forward movement or even guarantee the previous success, but using the mind to analyze in order to understand and form judgments by an effective process that giving purpose to curiosity. So what happens is our curiosity and imagination are there, but now in this case, they're actually kind of in their adventure. They have a colleague that they can trust to kind of give them more tangible, more sound kind of like understanding of what it is they seek for. So in the fact that like if you kind of like want to make your weapon lighter and you wanted to make it kind of stronger, there are certain things you can do in terms of understanding the way in which metal is kind of made out of kind of its constituent parts. You can look at aerodynamics, you can look at shapes, you can look at motions, you can kind of think of that in terms of your own physical training. I mean, one of the things I was looking at recently, we just had in fact, the NFL draft is going on as we speak. I think there's 1 day left. This is now Sunday morning. But one of the things amazing, and I've always enjoyed watching this, even though I think it's more kind of like an interesting entertainment than I think a good way to evaluate, potential success in NFL football. I also am upset that I'm probably not going to, I'm 66 years old as of a couple of weeks ago. I'm probably not going to get drafted again. And though I didn't play college football and I was a miserable high school football player, there's always that idea. I still do my own combine. I kind of like.
You're probably not going to get drafted.
Probably not, but again, it's like, I just think like, look, and I think it like, this is something we talk about, everyone talks about the idea of DEI. And I think one of the things that like, the professional sports team leagues do is they're kind of prejudiced against people who suck at sports.
Wait, I just have to.
Wait, let me just finish this.
Sorry.
But think about it.
Yeah.
Everybody in the NHL is good at hockey. Mm-hmm. Everyone in the NBA is good at basketball. Everyone in pickleball or whatever. But everyone in the NFL is good at football. I look at it like that's prejudiced against me. I should have the same opportunity. Based on, affirmative action and DEI, there shouldn't be a prejudice against those people who can't play the game.
There's still a chance you'll be drafted.
No, I won't get drafted, but that's because of the prejudice inherent against people who are not good at sports. Now, I'm not saying I could probably I could. Okay. So that's basically that. Okay.
All right.
Okay. So behold our art, the manifestation of our purpose, that we may understand through our analysis its consequence, so that we can come to articulate and anticipate our advancement and better comprehend and refine our purpose. We look upon the desire of the artistic individual and appraise the consequence because we understand the nature of the effort being manifest. We compare it to past achievements and contemporaries and created a hierarchy that, though never perfect, is understandable and explainable to anyone willing to expand the effort to understand and form their own judgments. Now, again, in the case of science, as opposed to like that, which we kind of say exists in the kind of more subjective realm in terms of literature, art, and things like that, there is the possibility for like downright manipulation and kind of telling somebody that this is brilliant when in fact, it's the emperor's new clothes. I'm not going to get into that. But the whole idea is that there is critical acumen that can be engaged in terms of understanding and making kind of like compelling arguments and being persuasive. We talked about that a little bit last week, is the fact that persuasion comes from the ability to make the compelling argument as regards that which is under discussion. So we compare it to past achievements and its contemporaries and recapture the high road that never perfect is understandable and explainable to anyone willing to expend the effort to understand and form their own judgments. Just as the weapon can be analyzed physically, mechanically, structurally, the drawing is looked upon these ways as well as psychologically, behaviorally, mentally, neurologically. I look upon one of my favorite pieces, Leonardo's sketch of the angel, the Virgin of the Rocks, and feel that my countless hours of study of this beautiful artifact is capable of expressing some of the most deep and essential emotional resonance ever realized by anyone. When I gaze at this, I come to feel as if I am engaged with the essence of benevolence. In the sketch, the angel is both protective and welcoming without judgment, the epitome of graceful charity. You feel that you are accepted to join with them, regardless of your character or circumstance. This simple embodiment of strength that supports the willingness to accept all that would look to join in their company. This is not whim or guess, and even though subjected, is rigorous. And study of philosophy, theology, history, psychology, behavioral science gives our curiosity a range to our imagination to substantively discuss the value and consequence of these items under consideration. Now, that was kind of like not the completion. We talked about survival and purpose, tradition and art, society and culture, and technique, science, art, and reason. Okay, so that was the piece that I wrote. Wasn't finished, but basically I can kind of see how I can build on that. One of the things I think I've come to understand in terms of this thing is that what I did in this case was I started to say that once we start to kind of like make this unbreakable bond and we move it from kind of like mythology, superstition, religion to reason and science, we start to benefit from the ability to kind of have a better understanding of those things that we're engaging in. We not only can kind of show progress, we can anticipate and predict certain outcomes, which is something that previously we would not be able to do. However, leaving that as that, let's kind of take this a little bit further. So based on this idea now, as this pertains to civilization, right, which kind of builds on this idea of purpose and meaning, I feel at this point there's something very, very important that I need to kind of state. And that is the fact at a certain point, we decide, right, that there are certain things of consequence that are more important than that survival reality. So that's basically what I say in this piece. It's called Survival and Purpose. We make conditional our persistence. So where I say that architecture is the persistence of man against nature, there's a certain point where one decides if this engagement will continue. So what I feel was the first cultural invention or the first societal invention of a kind of like of an actual culture or civilized culture was suicide. Now, it was believed that only humans committed suicide, but we've now come to understand that that's probably, like most of our aspects of understanding human animal behavior, completely ridiculous. So it seems as if certain animals understand the fact that they can't, kind of cut their own throats with a razor blade, but they can put themselves in a position where they would starve to death, drown, or whatever, but they put themselves in positions where their survival is basically compromised and it isn't their first priority. So this idea of subsistence, of persistence, of survival does get overridden in animal culture. And I think one of the things that's great about, I would say, in my lifetime studying behavior and studying kind of like humanity is the fact that we are animals and that we are not in this kind of isolated case. I mean, as much as I feel as like, again, I don't study linguistics. I didn't study linguistics. I'm not going to comment on Noam Chomsky. I will say that I'm sorry to hear that his mental and physical condition has deteriorated, and it's like he's unable to continue to give his commentary. I hope that somehow we can find a way to overcome this, and he can still continue to comment. But I think that his idea of kind of separating humans from animals in terms of their ability to kind of like conduct language was, I think, foolish, and I think that it kind of like was a little bit, anthropocentric and kind of arrogant. Anyway, I think maybe in terms of coming to understand that, I think that like Bronowski's analysis in regards to Chomsky is actually quite clear and quite true in terms of the fact that he also embraces the idea of the metaphor as a kind of thing beyond that of language. Anyway, I mean, so what happens is we decide the conditions by which we continue. So at a certain point, we realize once we have established certain things that are important to us, those things can become so important to us, so meaningful, that we would say that without them, we don't want to continue. That we say that only in these conditions would we want to basically persist. And I think this is kind of something that kind of like is something to be very proud of. Not the fact that you want to commit suicide or that you want to end a culture, but if indeed that a culture was destroyed, there are certain things that are valuable that you would protect it in in exchange for your own life. And I think the fact that like men, mostly men, but people go out to war in order to kind of protect that which is important. So the idea is, I will sacrifice my life for the survival of the group. One of the things that I've always appreciated is the fact that my country, United States, has this tradition, and that we did have a draft, and I think the draft basically ended in Vietnam. Since then, the reality is those people who choose to defend the nation have decided to go and do that, even though it's not expected of them. A lot of countries have mandatory military service. Israel has mandatory military service. I think a lot of, other countries have it. I don't know if mandatory military service is a good thing. Again, I don't know what it would look like. I don't know if I would have done really well in that circumstance. Again, it's like I would have loved the physical training, the running up and down hills, and kind of like maybe shooting cans off the fence. But I think the idea of following orders to the severity of taking life is something that is somewhat problematic to me. I can understand the concept, but I think the reality would be something that I don't have the conscious ability to do. I think that I was watching a podcast, and this individual was talking about the fact that one of the things that he said is like, you really shouldn't admire special forces soldiers, because it's like we're not heroes, we're sociopaths. And he explained the fact that one of the things that he said he came to understand, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that he had been in situations where he had done things where, as a result of kind of what he had to do. And he said he thought at a certain point that he would have to confront some of those regrets or some of those concerns. And he said he became troubled or worried about the fact that that time never came. And it wasn't because he was just this patriot that, oh, I'm doing good and all these people were bad people. It was the fact that his body was not the kind of body that would ever send the message of, hey, you know what, you need to regret, these things that you did, regardless of what they were. So it wasn't that he was a sensitive individual who took these things to heart. It was the fact that he wasn't. And I think one of the things about pain, and this is a kind of subject that goes back, we're getting a little bit off track, but we'll get back on after this, is that people talk about strength, and they always say like men are stronger than women, because they can lift more weight at the gym. But no one ever thinks about it in terms of the ability to endure pain. Now, one of the things is there are certain people who can endure a lot of suffering because they don't feel anything. But I think that in my case, one of the things that maybe makes me a valuable artist is the fact that I feel everything. So my strength would be measured against the relationship of my strength to how much I feel the things that I do, as opposed to the person who feels nothing. And I think that's a kind of degree in which we can kind of look at the fact that like the ability to endure suffering has to and somehow relate to the amount of pain that you feel at the same time. Now, again, you can endure pain, but the level of which pain you feel is something that is kind of subjective. In fact, and I mean by that is the fact that each person will feel a different level of suffering as opposed to the kind of pain that they have in their body. In fact, someone said that like pale redhead people, like what we would refer to as ginger people, have a tremendous amount of sensitivity. And so maybe they feel a lot more, like the same thing that, two people were subjected to the same amount of, say, electrical impulse. One person would maybe feel a tremendous amount and one person would not. Now, again, the ability to endure is also something that you can discipline yourself to do, but it's like talent. There are people who have a tremendous amount of a natural ability, but if it's not at a certain point, if it's not engaged in, that will really not amount to anything. So back to this idea. So we make conditions under which we decide to persist. And those things we've seen, not just in terms of people going to war to defend those things and sacrificing its own people. Now, again, this is not sacrificing to an imaginary idea that it's going to make it rain. This is a knowledge of knowing what you're doing. This is knowing that you're sending people to die, and it could still be in vain. Now, in the superstitious mythological world, you believe that by doing this, you get a benefit. The reality of kind of now looking at this from a reasonable point of view is there's no guarantee for that. This could be just a vain sacrifice. And that's what we kind of live with as the existential result of that situation, which is an incredibly severe circumstance to have to endure. It's like we know that we're basically saying, in order for our civilization to exist, for order for our culture to endure, we're willing to sacrifice our children in order to protect those things which we feel are important, so that if we would go, we'd all go. And we're willing to make that understanding. So there's the point where we see, during war times when people went to the museums and tried to carry out the precious artifacts that were the kind of like icons and kind of symbols of the greatness of that culture. We also know that one of the things that when people kind of like vanquish a foe, the thing that they will do will be to destroy those pieces that are revered. And in fact, right now, one of the things I think that's happening is, like, my own personal feeling is that the West is under siege because of its greatness, because of its genius. And there's a tremendous amount of kind of resentment, envy, and jealousy because of the fact that people see this, and as a result of kind of coming to ages of maturity, either can take an adult response or a childish response. The childish response, when you kind of come across something that makes you uncomfortable, is to basically try to eliminate it. The mature response is basically kind of like to basically own up to saying, like, okay, I need to see how I measure up, because this is something that needs to be here because the whole world benefits from its existence. We're at the point where there's a lot of people, and I guess I would relate this to what Ortega says about the fact that the mass man engages in nothing of himself, and he sees that there's nothing he needs to do in terms of like his particular circumstance. He has no obligations or responsibilities to society. So therefore, he doesn't feel any compulsion to rise to a situation to kind of embrace his destiny. And I think that's the kind of situation is these people, these kind of like mass individuals, basically don't see anything other than their feeling of kind of inadequacy. So their attitude is like, I expect nothing of myself, so I don't have to be accountable for my feeling of inadequacy. Whereas the individual of kind of higher ability, higher kind of like essence, will basically put to himself, we need to understand and appreciate this destiny and these accomplishments in order to maintain them, because the organization by which we got to this point, if not maintained, will fall. So again, we come to the situation as we have to basically become conscious of our circumstance, of how we got here and what is necessary to maintain it. And again, that can't happen if you see no particular obligations or responsibilities other than simply being here. So we have that now as the kind of like sense of kind of like privilege and responsibility. We all see many people who are kind of talking about the idea of their entitlement and their endowment and all these other things, but at the same time don't talk of their accountability and the responsibility and obligation. So I think what happens is we forget to check the organization with which things come together. And I think that again is kind of like an indictment of the inability, and I realize this now, it's an indictment of the inability to understand the precious and essential nature of that organization that basically pertains to maintaining our society, so that this culture can look to the fact that there are reasons why we are here. I think another one of them is a kind of very specious critique of America, is the fact that like this all happened by accident. We didn't accidentally get to the moon. We didn't accidentally become the powerful nation that we are. There were certain things that we did in order to kind of get there. There were certain opportunities that we took advantage of, and there were certain things that we kind of basically failed at. But the reality is, one doesn't get to be America by accident. And again, that I think, the critique of that is just incredibly superficial. It shows absolutely no understanding of the organization that manifested. I mean, that you can go back and critique the way in which capitalism was manifest and regulated, and you could talk about the antitrust laws, you could talk about all these things. It's an incredible great discussion. But the reality is you can't negate the fact that it happened and the fact that it didn't it didn't have to happen, right? So what happens is this inevitability is not inevitable. It's just the same way the traditions don't necessarily lead to culture, because there doesn't come that time that you say there are conditions by which if these conditions are met, we refuse to continue. And I've talked about this in my own case, and the fact that, like, being a child of the World's Fair in 1964 and coming to understand the potential and possibility of the horizon of dreams, that at 66 years old, rather than kind of sitting here, somewhere in the kind of like in New York City, that I would be on a deep space mission in a space probe that was basically going to kind of like be my end and turn back into the stardust from which me and everything that I know on this planet came from. Instead, what I'm trying to do now is kind of like survive this incredibly corrupt and kind of somewhat disorganized chaos that's quite a mess in our society right now. I mean, New York City, the United States, the world at this point, 2025, is kind of an embarrassment. It's a kind of festering kind of like hate fest, resentment of success. Like I said, if I was to put it in a term, I would say it's the manifestation of the resentment of genius by the rabble. So to kind of further the Ortegan kind of like idea, it's not just the revolt of the masses, it's kind of like potentially the reign of the masses. And two foreseeable consequences of that is not just what we see in terms of the animosity and kind of like resentment of genius, is the fact that we, by not checking ourselves relative to our destiny, will not be able to maintain the organization that sustains us. So as a result, we will become part of the fossil record based on our own ignorance. And, one of the examples that was very telling and very scary to me was recently when I watched the wildfires in California. Now, it wasn't as if I want to basically be critical of, the situation. I want to basically look at the fact that we forgot about something that's essential. Now, again, we can decide if we want to survive or not. But I think when we want to survive, but we basically believe that we don't have to check and understand the maintenance of the issues of the organizational structure that got us here, that we don't maintain our own infrastructure, that's just stupid. So I would like to have, and I've talked about this, and maybe I'll make an issue about this, is that after seeing the Turkey earthquakes, after seeing some of the things, I've talked about this before, there is certain circumstances that were never intended to be fixed, that no one cared, and it was just basically corruption and graft, and then a complete lack of concern to ever try to help the situation become stable. And I think when you see these third world countries where they're just basically kind of like doing whatever they can to survive, and they're not really thinking about the safety of their infrastructure, because they realize we're lucky to kind of have a power at all. Now, that's not the situation in the United States, or shouldn't be the position in the United States. And again, coming home tonight on the subway and seeing the fact that this subway, I don't think there's a single person in this city that will tell you that the subway system in 2025 is in any way more advanced or any more capable than it was in 1970. And in fact, the only thing I can see is that we now have the signs that basically tell us when the next train is not coming. So it'll basically say, next train 3 minutes, and 20 minutes later it shows up. But I mean, the only real advancements are kind of like electronic signs. But, I find as if there's been more change than there was progress. And I can't really say that, and again, part of the subway circumstance is the kind of failure of other programs like the, Department of Mental Health and the kind of Transit Authority, as well as like the police department and policing in general. But we have not seen a technological advance in the subway system. Um, you know, we're maintaining it, we're not improving it, and it's kind of like we're just continually stopping it from collapsing. So the idea is, where is this? What is our goal? Where are we headed? Like I said, when I was a boy in the 60s, I saw the possibility of things moving towards uh, more capability, more sustenance, more consequence. And now I don't see that. I see us basically holding on by our fingers and trying to not have it all fall apart and spiral out of control. There's always going to be adversaries. There's always going to be kind of naysayers. There's always going to be hope, kind of people who, and they actually, this is going to sound strange, but they actually serve a purpose. There's a benefit to the haters. Now, one of the things, and I'm guilty of this myself, is that oftentimes when we see things that we see as consequential, we have a tendency to overindulge in their appreciation. And by that, I mean the person who hates us is always going to look for that thing that they're looking for, that glaring error, so they can basically kind of like try to take us down. So there's a benefit to that, because sometimes that person will kind of look at us with an eye more critical than we would look at ourselves. So there's a benefit to those people. And in fact, I love the fact that there are always going to be people who will always have a problem, because they keep us sharp. Now, I mean, they can be annoying, but the thing is, it's kind of like anything else. When they kind of, bring something to you and say, look what you've done, you have to be able to kind of separate, as I've said, the intent, which is their hatred, from the information, which could be potentially valuable. Is like, and in this case, what I'm looked at, when I look at that in terms of like California and Los Angeles, I said, here was a situation where we neglected our infrastructure. And as a result, we put ourselves in a circumstance we should never have put ourselves in. Now, I talked about, I think, the idea of like the Fukushima plant, and the Fukushima plant basically was subjected to a circumstance it hadn't been designed for. And also other things that kind of happened that they kind of didn't foresee, that might have been a sense of poor planning, but poor planning at a kind of extreme circumstance. So the fact that the pumps failed and the generators failed, and they were incapable of kind of pumping water onto the core after it had been breached and it had kind of failed, was something that was an additional circumstance that maybe was kind of like, maybe was something that they could have foreseen, but given the consequence of how this transpired, it seemed as if it was also kind of potentially a lot of bad luck. But bad luck sometimes is the kind of thing that you can eliminate by basically engineering better. So in that case, I'm willing to kind of say, let's see. In the case of Turkey and the earthquakes, it was never intended to be a situation where they were trying to make, safe conditions. California is America, and America has always prided itself on having a kind of robust infrastructure. And we have, I think, the need here to look at this situation and say, hey, we talk about these things, and everyone wants to talk about the possibility of like, kind of having a more sustainable, more kind of robust. And I'd say instead of sustainable, I'd say more robust. I think we need to have a more robust infrastructure. I think we need to kind of start looking at the things that we're falling behind in. I remember what was interesting was that during the years of the 60s, I remember like that Boeing was looking at a supersonic transport, and I remember building a model of it and looking at it. It looked a lot like the British Concorde. And I think, Air France and British Airways and Boeing, for which, we're looking at the possibility. And what happened was, whereas they succeeded, we basically decided not to. And then I also looked at the fact that monorails and high-speed rails were all those things that we talked about in the 60s. When I look at that in terms of like the Middle East and the Far East and Asia, and I look at Europe, and I look at that as an abysmal, neglectful failure of engineering. And I look at the fact that California couldn't even do their high-speed rail project. But I was thinking of the fact that I remember looking at a map and thinking to myself, what the world needs is a universal high-speed link system that connects all the land masses and all the the corners of the globe, in terms of the fact that, you know, people would say, talk about like building walls and things like that. I think what we need to build is roads and bridges and connections, so that basically we can have, you know, still have borders and still have robust nationalities, but allow more of an interchange, not just of products, but of ideas and individuals. So anyway, these are ideas that I'm kind of looking at past the things that I talked about in my my article. So I think what's good is that, you know, that was the purpose here, was that seeing where the things could be enhanced. So now when I've made some notes on this, I'll go back and kind of look at how that kind of like bears out. So, okay, that's pretty much what I have for today. And next week, we'll start to go into something that I think also kind of bears importance in terms of this consequence of these ideas. And I think now, kind of like as we're going into it, and we've talked about indictments of societal health, I want to kind of go to what I would see as kind of three pillars of what basically kind of manifests not just Western civilization, but is the kind of core components of any civilization. And I would say that those three components are truth, beauty, and love. So next week, we're going to talk about truth, beauty, and love, and they're kind of abstract. And then we'll basically kind of take each one for the next one, truth, beauty, and love. So next week, which would be 4th of May, we'll talk about love, beauty, and truth. Then we'll talk about truth, then beauty, then love. And I think that kind of brings us up to a point where we will have, that'll be like number 26. And then we'll kind of like continue where we go from there. But I think in that point, we've kind of gone through these kind of indictments and this kind of like this idea of the kind of like component parts that give us an essence of where we need to go. But I think the next thing is to kind of understand, like, and this is a question I've been thinking about recently, is given this fall, given this distraction, given this movement away from taking our eye off the ball and understanding our destiny. And I gotta have to come up with another term, because I mean, Ortega uses the term destiny, but these societal circumstances that we need to kind of understand so that we can kind of be innovative in them rather than basically falling prey to them. A good example, you know, kind of an example would be when Frank Lloyd Wright saw the possibility of suburbanization, and he set out to make his Broadacre City plan. And, you know, in that case, he basically said, well, we can let the developers do it, or we as architects can basically try to solve it. That might be a good project, is to kind of look at that and kind of like make that critique. But because but I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a historian. You know, I mean, that might be a good kind of fun project, might assign a student to. But I think in this case, what's important is the fact that we, you know, kind of understand that we need to kind of get back to this purposefulness of what is our destiny and how to get back to understanding, so that my existential fear is that it's not that we're not paying attention and we, you know, and well, we just have to kind of go back and kind of take control. My fear is that we don't know how to take control, and that if we go to try to kind of like, you know, the ship might be kind of drifting, but I don't know if the shift is something that we can really regain control of. COVID scared me in the fact that a lot of kind of infrastructural things that we thought we took for granted, that we thought we understood, we took for granted. And now as a result, there's certain things that just haven't come back. Now, I mean, I need to maybe do some more analysis of that, but the reality is I just see the fact that infrastructure seems to be a lot more fragile and not a lot less robust. So maybe what happens is we need to have a Secretary of Engineering, and the Secretary of Engineering should be a cabinet post, federal level, state level, maybe even city level in big places like LA, so that basically there's someone there to remind us, it's like, hey man, we need to have water. We need to have the ability to kind of like, in these certain circumstances, be able to deal with this. The more and more I look at it, the more I look at like the fact that like these were circumstances in LA that we were capable of understanding, but we simply weren't prepared for it. And as a result, we've inflicted this damage upon ourselves. Now, my the question I kind of put to you is it possible, in the fact that we do understand that there is man-made effect to climate and there's man-made climate change, if it's man-made or not, the point is the climate changes. The reality is climate always changes, and it changes in a beneficial way or detrimental way given organic life, given our life. So the point is, given what we see and what we're modeling and what we're understanding, not only are there things that do not have engineering solutions. Maybe we'd like to identify that. But in the cases where we can identify engineered solutions, why are we not doing that? So instead of the idea like the earth is, the sky is falling, which is very possibly it is, why aren't we specifically engaging in these engineering projects to say, why is our infrastructure not robust enough? Why? Because the reality is it's our survival. So, there's survival for its own sake, and then there's survival to maintain a culture that's valuable. I believe it's important to kind of maintain a culture that's valuable. And I believe that America represents a certain particular valuable essence in Western society that needs to be maintained because there's an inherent potential for great genius beyond the great genius that we've seen. So I'll leave it at that. And next week is Love, Beauty, and Truth, in episode 23. Thank you very much. And we leave with the same every week. The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain it. Thank you.